Уважаемые участники форума, фестивальную программу...
Dear forum participants, the festival program Moscow Urban Fest is started by the lecture of a star speaker, Narrow Corridor. The lecturer is professor of the MIT Applied Economics, Daron Acemoglu. Moderator, Konstantin Sonyan, economist, professor of the Chicago University and the High School of Economics.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. Today we're going to have a lecture by Daron Acemoglu. Daron Acemoglu, professor at the MIT University, who is one of the greatest scientists and economists of modern age. He authored hundreds of articles, and for us, even dozens of articles is a lot. And he wrote hundreds of articles which are very high-tech, and you might be aware of how complex the mathematics and mathematical statistics are in his works. And today he will tell us about the theory of a narrow corridor in his book. The floor is yours, Daron. Unfortunately, the speaker cannot be heard.
Кого попросить? Daron, do you hear me? Somehow we do not hear you. Is microphone on? Huh. That's interesting because I see you, but I do not hear you. Так что в зале звука нет.
There is no sound in the room.
Okay, can you say something? Yeah. Okay, I think this will be sorted out eventually, but for now, your sound doesn't go through. Okay, maybe I could teach this lecture on your behalf. I don't know.
Yes.
Oh,
that would be great.
Oh, that's already working. I heard you when you said yes. So
yeah,
now,
you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all I did was to stop sharing, so let me see whether you will continue to hear me as I share. Can you hear me now?
I hear you now. I do not see your presentation, but I hear you.
I think the presentation will come in a second. Can you see the presentation as well now?
Now I see the presentation. Can you say something?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Great.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Excellent, Konstantin. Great.
Go ahead.
Well, I was saying how happy I was to be joining you, Konstantin, for the Moscow Forum, albeit virtually, and I'm going to spend the next half hour audio visual challenges notwithstanding, to share some ideas about building better institutions, both locally and globally, and lessons from the narrow corridor, my latest book with Jim Robinson. So the challenge for many countries throughout the 20th century and continuing in the 21st is to move away from this. This is a picture of children forced into cotton fields in Uzbekistan under Islam Karimov to work as cheap labor, to this, meaning some notion of justice, which we argue has always been one of the main passions and desires of people. But also in the 21st century, I think it is impossible to have justice without people having some voice through democracy and civil society and other means. So how do we actually do this? Well, I think we need to be a little bit clear about what we mean by justice. And Jim and I think that narrow definitions of justice are not up to the task. And for that, we take a somewhat broader definition from philosopher Philip Pettit. His definition of dominance is when somebody has too much power over you, to live at the mercy of somebody in a manner that leaves you vulnerable, subject to the arbitrary will of somebody else. So we think that justice has to start from a notion of non-dominance, lack of this type of excessive power of one person over other, one group over other, even institutions over individuals. And many people were very optimistic about these types of ideas spreading, somehow perhaps couched in some idyllic version of liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama, for example, predicted the end of history as the Berlin Wall came down. He called it an unabashed victory of political and economic liberalism. For a while, it looked like he was right. There was the third wave of democracy where democratic countries flourished and democracy expanded in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. But over the last 15 years, according to Freedom House, every year we've had more countries leave the democratic institutions behind or have worsening democratic scores than those that have better democratic scores. So in the late 2010s, for example, about 30 or 40 countries every year, more than those that became more democratic, moved towards more authoritarianism or dictatorship. Now, that's not the only way that people thought the future will be shaped. Another perspective was articulated by the international scholar Robert Kaplan. He thought that actually the future would be very problematic, and he put this coming of anarchy as the central theme of the way that he was talking about the future. You can think of this as a modern version of Thomas Hobbes's nightmare, where there will be too much fighting between different groups, between different individuals. Lives of people will be poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and mostly because of what Thomas Hobbes thought was very important for any type of justice, a strong state. And in fact, Kaplan's predictions seemed much more on target over the last 10 years. These are the helmets that the Iraqi army left behind as they fled in front of the Islamic State. There is no better encapsulation of Robert Kaplan's fears or Thomas Hobbes's fears than the Islamic State's rule in Syria and Iraq. And of course, it was preceded by the complete collapse of state institutions. But in fact, perhaps most people today will think that neither Kaplan nor Fukuyama, but a bunch of other scholars who have been worried about the revenge of the state, what Yuval Noah Harari calls digital dictatorships. Technology is moving in such a direction with much better monitoring, with much better AI technologies, that we are going to see the state become stronger and stronger and extinguish any room for civil society. Perhaps that will be terrible for justice, or if you're in China, perhaps you'll think this is going to be great for justice. But even this prediction, I think, is problematic, and all of these predictions, in fact, have something in common. They are very much in the spirit of sort of Marx's inevitability type of predictions about how society is organized. Famously, Marx said the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill gives you society with the industrial capitalist. And we are thinking now today perhaps AI and social media will give you society with the digital big brother, or the international order will give you collapsing states in the marginal areas such as Middle East. I'm going to argue that this is not the right perspective. But it is important that in thinking about the evolution of institutions around the world, we're also, I'm going to skip these. These are just some of the pictures that illustrate people's fears, like AI facial recognition cameras in Tiananmen Square, or the social credit system in China. But I think it's important to also understand that some of the forces that are going to shape the next 20 years of economic and political development are the problems that Western societies are having. And I think Western societies are having both economic and social challenges, but since time is short, I want to focus on the economic challenges. Today, I think the root cause of those challenges is an inability to generate high-quality growth, in particular, fast productivity growth. The omnibus measure that economists use for understanding productivity is total factor productivity, how much we are making better use of capital and labor. And according to Robert Gordon's estimates, total factor productivity per annum was around 3% in the 1950s and around 2% in the 60s, 70s, 40s, 30s. Today, despite all these AI technologies, digital technologies, new widgets, we are barely making 0.5%. Now, this is slow growth, but even more importantly, it's low quality growth. One aspect of that, which has been very discombobulating socially, has been the increase in inequality. Just to give you a sense of that, I am actually going to show here what's going on with men's wages in the US as divided by education. So the red here are American men with less than high school degree. These are with high school. These are with postgraduate degrees, and these are college degrees. In the 60s and also in the 50s, you have the period of a rising tide lifting all boats. That was happening for all demographic groups more or less equally. But now, over the last 30 years, you see much greater inequality, but even also socially quite problematically, you see this huge decline in the real earnings of low education men, which has been, of course, a very important driver of populism, discontent, support for Donald Trump, and so on. This has not been an easy process, not just because of wages, but it's also because of the shock that the middle class has faced. Here, what I'm showing you is the distribution of employment in the US, and these yellow ones, or light brown ones, for different decades, are the middle class occupations: factory workers, clerical jobs, back office workers, sales workers. So this is the heart of the middle class in the US. And you see that in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, all decades, these jobs have disappeared. There are fewer and fewer Americans that hold these middle class jobs. What's happened to them? If you're a college worker, you've been able to find some better jobs: engineering technicians, lawyers, auditors, accountants. But if you're a non-college worker, and that's where all these real wage declines comes from, all of these middle-class jobs have been replaced by low-quality jobs: food preparation, McDonald's, home care, custodial security jobs, etc. So you can see why that's been going on. This is a factory floor. You don't see any workers. It's just it's produced by robots. But I think it's also important to recognize this is not just a US phenomenon. The same has happened everywhere. So if I do the same division now for other OECD, other advanced Western nations, you see this red bars is the middle class jobs between 1990s and mid-2000s. They have disappeared everywhere. So these automation and globalization trends have impacted all of these countries. And in fact, you might worry this is just the inevitable march of robots. There's a sense in which this is true, and there's a sense in which it's not, and this is very important because I'm going to bring all of these together with the framework of the narrow corridor. And the sense in which it's true is that indeed, not just robots, but a variety of other automation technologies have been intimately linked to the disappearance of these middle-class jobs. So here, what I'm showing you is what's happened across different parts of the United States, across 722 commuting zones. And this is the industrial heartland of the United States. But both with and without these places, you see that the more robot adoption has been going on in a local economy, the lower is employment and the lower is wages in these places. But also importantly, this is the no part, automation is not a new phenomenon. Robots are new, AI is new, but automation has been going on forever. Certainly since the middle of the 18th century, when spinning and weaving machines started replacing workers that skilled artisans used to perform. But the problem is that during periods of healthy growth and rapid productivity growth that I showed you earlier on, automation was counterbalanced by other more human-friendly technologies. We found ways of creating new jobs and new tasks. That's what's missing. Now we see two legs of the challenges for the future. How are we going to create more just, more participatory systems politically? And how are we going to create more participatory systems economically, which has a technological and a social element? Both of these, I'm going to argue, are both local and global challenges. But in order to understand it, first let's develop, for the next 10 minutes, some of the outlines of the conceptual framework that Jim and I laid out. But also, I will have occasion at the end to come back to the hyper-global challenges, such as coronavirus, globalization, liberty, and so on. Let us start with how humans thought about this long before the 20th century. In fact, the early surviving written records are the Sumerian tablets from 4,200 years ago, and they tell the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. The tablets start by explaining how a wonderful civilization the city of Uruk was. Its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun, wonderful stone cases, beautiful buildings, brickwork, and amazing gardens, glorious palaces, shops, marketplaces, houses. This is exactly the kind of local economy that today we would be very happy to develop. But there's a hitch. Gilgamesh, who is at first suggested as the architect of this wonderful thing, you realize quickly is not. He has all of the hallmarks of a typical despot. Who is like Gilgamesh? No other king has inspired such awe. Who else can say, I alone rule supreme among mankind? The city is his possession. He tramples the citizens like a wild bull. He does whatever he wants, takes the son from his father, crushes him, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. No one dares to oppose him. So you'll see, in line with my claim earlier on, that this notion of justice, not being dominated, not being crushed, is part of the human psyche forever. You can see it here. This is the thing that really the Sumerian tablets are about. People are not happy because they don't have justice. They don't have liberty because they're dominated by the elite, here represented by Gilgamesh. What can they do? Actually, immediately the tablets explain something that, again, should be familiar to us. As soon as you have despotism, you try to find solutions to that despotism. And the first one that these tablets talk about is what you might call the checks and balances solution. According to the epic, the citizens cry to the heavens and ask the god of the sky to stop Gilgamesh. And Anu, the god of sky, comes up with a solution to contain Gilgamesh. Create a double, Enkidu, somebody who's going to be able to balance out Gilgamesh. So you might think of this as a precursor of the checks and balances that, for example, the US Constitution is so keen on. Enkidu is like another branch of the government. It's as powerful as Gilgamesh, and is going to prevent Gilgamesh from doing all the bad things. And in fact, in the epic, it looks like this doppelganger or the checks and balances solution works. The two beat each other, and Gilgamesh cannot ravage the bride that he was trying to steal. But in fact, it's not so effective. In fact, you can see that in the Gilgamesh epic, because a few pages later, you realize Enkidu and Gilgamesh are now ganging together and working together in order to do the despotism and fight the monsters and so on. So the starting point of the conceptual framework of the narrow corridor is therefore that you're not going to be able to design institutions that miraculously create balance, create justice, create non-dominance, create liberty. You need that to be the outcome of society's mobilization itself. So this is the notion of shackled Leviathan that James and I propose. You need to have a strong state, but that strong state needs to be shackled not by constitutions, although constitutions have a role, but primarily by society. It needs to have the citizens be engaged in politics. And that's, again, true both locally and politically and globally, locally and nationally, which is what I'm going to explain. The challenges locally are different than the challenges nationally. Neither is easy, but both are central in that you want to have a Leviathan that's capable and delivers justice like what Hobbes wants. You don't want the collapse of the state like in the Middle East, but you also want to contain that Leviathan. You don't want it to become despotic. And this conceptual framework can be best understood using this diagram, which we use as the centerpiece of our book. Really, what you need is a balance between the power of society, collective action, organization, institutionalized means such as democracy, and the power of the state. When the state is very strong, like in China historically or Russia today, you have the despotic Leviathan. The state is too strong, it silences society, civil society gets weaker and weaker. You see these trajectories, they go towards weaker and weaker power of society. But when the state is very weak, that's not good either. That's like what Robert Kaplan was afraid of, coming of anarchy. You have the happy medium in this corridor where the power of the state and society are balanced, and then you see the coevolution of state and society. That's really important. This is what we call red queen dynamics. Here, you see that as the state gets stronger, society gets weaker. Here, the state gets weaker. Whereas in this corridor, you have this positive coevolution. As the state gets stronger, society has to get stronger for you to stay in the corridor, because if the society didn't get stronger, then you would have the despotic Leviathan. So it is critical to contain the power of the state, even as the state itself shoulders greater responsibilities. Again, this is critical for both local and national politics, as I'm going to explain. This is, again, not just a current problem. Perhaps the Gilgamesh epic did not fully recognize the role of society, given the early stages, but other early civilizations did. Best, the Athenian polity, which is where democracy emerges. Athenian society is really a perfect specimen of what I was trying to capture with that corridor, because you see that the development of the Athenian state, which became much, much more powerful, introduced some of the things that we associate with modern state of the 20th century, like social insurance, district court judge systems, monetary policy, orphanages. All of that happened while at the same time the state was becoming very constrained by new democratic institutions. In fact, the Athenians were highly suspect of the power of elites, which is what you really require, not respecting big autocrats or autocrats wannabe. You want to cut them down. And this is what the Athenians were great. One of the laws that the great lawmaker of the Athenians, Cleisthenes, passed is called the ostracism law. Every year, the Athenian Democratic Assembly would vote whether there should be an ostracism. And if there was an ostracism, all Athenian citizens would write the name of a person on a broken shard, a piece of pottery broken, which is called an ostrakon. That's where the name ostracism comes from. And then whoever name was written most would be banished, exiled from the city for 10 years. So here you see a piece of broken shard with Themistocles' name written on it. Themistocles is as big a hero as Athenians have ever known, saved Athens twice. But at some point, people thought he was getting too powerful, too much of an elite, too bossy, and they exiled him from the city. So to many political scientists, if you explain this, they will think, well, that is going to make state much less powerful, because the state is always under the control of society. Its elites are always going to be cut to size. But in fact, the red queen dynamics that I explained really says that contested power is greater power. In other words, really this what propels the state to reach greater and greater levels of power, as this trajectory shows, is really its competition as well as cooperation with the state. Why is this relevant for our problems? Well, I think there are two elements of this framework that are critical for understanding the issues at hand. One is about what really is critical for building understanding and building capable states. Local state capacity is one of the most important challenges facing nations today. Corruption is local, public goods are local, democracy has to start from the local level, and justice provision must start from the local level. But what determines powerful states? This is actually one of the main themes of political science, but James and I think that the explanations provided by political science are not appropriate, and in fact, it's telling because it is going to be an important part of my story for technology as well as states. And the way that most of the theories in political sciences, they explain the importance of structural factors, such as nature of technology. Different technologies lead to different systems. Or as Tilley explained, the threat of war or geography. So the most famous one, for example, is powerfully captured by this pithy quote from Charles Tilley: states made war and war made the state. So in places where you had the threat of war internationally required a strong state, that led to the development of powerful state institutions and all the good things, both at the local and the national level. But actually, when you look at history, there are as many examples that contradict Tilley's claims as those that help Tilley's claims. And our framework explains why that's the case. What Tilley is saying is that there's a shock, a big change in military technology or international relations that increases the power of the state, that you can think of as a vertical change in this figure. And if you are like Switzerland, trying to survive against the threat of the Holy Roman Empire, that might be just the impetus that gets you into the corridor, and in the corridor, you travel along this trajectory to much greater levels of state capacity. Again, the Swiss story both is a local and a national one, because Swiss were fiercely local at the cantonal level. They formed a confederation in order to fight the Holy Roman Empire, but always emphasizing decentralized justice, decentralized public services. But you also see, just like the Prussian example here shows, the same impetus can take you out of the corridor. Or like the Montenegrins that fought the Ottomans all the time, it may do nothing to you. So there is no uniform, unconditional effect of technology or structural factors on the state, or on inequality, or on the development of justice, as I'm going to argue. It's all conditional, and it all depends on what you do with those changes. The Swiss found a way of building a confederation, changing their politics, and really built one of the most successful democratic liberty-supporting institutions. Prussians failed completely at that. Or what Francis Fukuyama was talking about, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Poland moved into the corridor and became both democratic and very rapidly growing, although the last 3 years, 4 years are witnessing some backtracking in political institutions. But contrary to what Francis Fukuyama was interpreting, Russia never moved into the corridor nationally. Locally, we'll come back to that in a second. So even the Yeltsin's deals weren't of the sort that you would expect from a shackled Leviathan, and they did nothing to improve Russian democratic institutions. Tajikistan is a completely different story, for example. So again, just like my account of what the early modern European war-making threats did, differentially to Switzerland, Montenegro, and Prussia, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union had very, very heterogeneous effects. Again, choice. The devil is always in the detail. That becomes really clear if you think about how you can move into the corridor. If you are here, strengthening the state is a way to move into the corridor because the state is too weak. But if you are here, just like Turkey, Russia, or China, then to move into the corridor, you need the society to become stronger. Civil society activism, collective action, greater monitoring, better democratic institutions. But what if you are here? So the only way, this is what we call path 3, is that you have to simultaneously make the state institutions work better and society's participation in politics better. Now, this might sound like the tallest order of them all, the hardest one. But in fact, I'm going to argue that there is some interesting, nice features of this path 3, which we can see especially at the local level. Because this type of failure, where both public institutions are failing and you are not able to control politicians and society becomes apolitical and disengaged, is actually a very common feature of many local governance problems. The best example is Lagos. Lagos was actually the country that Robert Kaplan picked to explain the coming of anarchy. In the early 1990s, Lagos had the most corrupt politicians, refuse was not being collected, gangs were ruling, there was zero tax revenue to provide public services, roads were completely falling apart. But then look at Lagos in the 2000s, and it's completely different. It becomes the most functional city, arguably in Africa. How did that happen? It's exactly path 3. There was a number of politicians led by Balu Ahmad Tunibu and then Fashula, who realized that in order to build state institutions which were necessary to provide services and to make sure that Lagos did not completely collapse, they also had to increase society's involvement in politics. And their promise from the beginning was, we're going to create better state institutions, but also more accountable institutions. Both of them became really involved with civil society, encouraged civil society. They gave their phone numbers for people to make individualized complaints about any bureaucrats that were corrupt. And this is exactly also what happened in Bogota. Bogota was almost as bad as Lagos. And this man became the mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mockus, again with a promise of fighting corruption at the same time as increasing the accountability of the politicians. Independently, he and his staff came up with the same strategy of giving their phone numbers, text messages, etc., in order to hear from the people. This is him dressed up as his version of Superman because he's the super fighter of corruption. Now, what does this imply for Moscow? Well, I think Moscow is struggling with exactly the same problem. Both Bogota and Lagos are examples of failing local institutions because they were embedded in despotic state institutions. And again, that's a problem that many capitals today are facing. Can they survive without national change? I think the answer is a mixed one. I think when you are at the local level, that creates a bigger room for maneuver. But let me actually make the final point about this. What about all of the problems that I explained about in the West? Inequality, the support for democracy slipping in the West. Well, it's the same idea. We have new technologies, digital technologies, AI technologies that are very capable. But in the same way that I'm arguing both at the local level and the national level, you can make very different things depending on where you are, depending how you use these technologies. You can create very different political systems. And in some cases, like the path 3 of Bogota and Lagos emphasizes, you can use them for leveraging new local institutions. The same is true at the national and the economic level in the West. So the West has to find a way of creating new technologies out of the platforms that are available to us that are better for inequality, better for opportunities for especially non-college workers. So therefore, we are now seeing the same picture, which is that we are in a critical juncture perhaps around the world, especially with the COVID crisis, where we have many choices about how to restructure governance, how to do the justice systems, the dispute resolution systems around the world, how we contain state institutions, and how we use these automation and globalization technologies for creating better welfare. And I will end with the warnings of this gentleman, Hayek. So when Western nations were building the welfare state, especially after the Beveridge Report was published in 1942, Hayek warned of a new totalitarianism. This means that, among other things, even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So what he was saying is, in some sense, despotism can creep in when the state becomes stronger. At the end, however, Hayek was wrong. And the reason why Hayek was wrong is precisely because he did not take into account the Red Queen effect. As the state became stronger, society became more involved in politics and better at monitoring bureaucrats and elites. And as a result, the West had the fastest growth and the most equal growth of any time in its history in the 3.5 decades that followed World War II. The key was this balance of power between elites and citizens, state and society. And the key is whether moving forward, when we have new challenges in the form of these inequality-producing technologies, COVID, and all of the issues of building local and global institutions like this Path 3, whether we can make that happen without this new totalitarianism threat. I think we have to prove Hayek wrong again, both locally and nationally, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and reactions to this picture that I have painted. Thank you very much.
Daron, большое спасибо.
Thank you, Daron. That was wonderful. That was very interesting. And we have several questions. My first question is, so according to your theory related to James Robinson and to the situation when some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and your theory of narrow corridor, according to which a constant balance is needed between society and the state. So these theories are illustrated by your books, and you take such countries like Moscow, I say Russia, and Moscow, it is not a country, but Moscow is bigger than some countries in the world. If Moscow were a country, it would be bigger than dozens of countries. So Moscow doesn't decide rules of a game, but may a city do something in a situation when a city doesn't really influence all the things that happen in the country?
Thank you, Konstantin. I think that's a fantastic question. It's a double-edged sword, I would say. On the one hand, and this is what I wanted to emphasize with the examples of Bogota and Lagos, cities have much greater freedom than national civil society organizations. By their very definition, as long as it is clear that local leaders are not going to challenge the national leader, they can build things that don't become a threat to the national system. While Bello Ahmed and Fashula were rebuilding Lagos, Nigeria was first a dictatorship and then a very unstable place. But nobody thought that these politicians were going to become a threat. Same thing in Bogota. But at the same time, this is a double-edged sword because they have to be careful. And at some point, those advances can be reversed. In Bogota, after Mocus, a bunch of corrupt mayors came and undid some of the reforms. And I think the situation in Moscow is very much related. Moscow has a very active tech industry. How it can survive is, I think, intimately linked to the fact that national politics doesn't care about this tech industry as long as it doesn't create a challenge to the national leadership. But that also means that not everything can be done and some things are unstable. If you create a new technology that's going to prevent government censorship, then it would become a threat to national leaders, and then perhaps all bets are off. It really depends on some of the details of the institutional system. I think what we are seeing in Russia as in parts of Africa, is that local politics can work to some degree. But in China, that's completely not the case. The Communist Party's control is much deeper, and they see local politics as very much a threat, even if it's a small city in the far-flung corners of the country. So the details of the nature of the control of the national party or the national bodies really matters for this.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this is a very important point to understand, that politics may be more competitive and it may lead to more efficient result after a process that you described as a narrow corridor. Even if on a national level there is a predominant vision that there must not be any politics on a local level. And I hope that your book about narrow corridor will be read by some people in Russia that would understand that they need local politics to advance on a local level. And do you believe that a political competition may exist on a local level, but not on a national level? Is it a possible concept?
Within limits. I think you can have local competition so long as national politicians don't interfere. But ultimately, I think one of the roles of major metropolitan areas like Moscow is also to train leaders for national competition later on. That is the paradox. If local politics works very well, then local politicians may become challengers in the future. And that is where the tensions start mounting.
No, but
So I think that a narrow corridor is good, comparing to your previous book, why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, because narrow corridor gives us a hope of going forward. Because when I read the book Why Some Countries Are Poor and Some Countries Are Rich, I understood why a phenomenon of a stagnation exists, but I didn't see any issue of this situation. And now I see that when we read narrow corridor, we may give some advice on what we have, what we may do.
Well, thank you, Konstantin. You're an optimist, because the way I would put it is that the narrow corridor says both. It says how you can get rid of bad institutions much more explicitly, but it also highlights how you can destroy institutions. So it depends on whether you see half full or half empty glass. I think some people look at the narrow corridor and they say, well, this narrowness of the corridor and all the problems we're having, everything is going to collapse in the next decade. So I'm glad you have a more optimistic reading.
Да, мне кажется,
I think that the message of this narrow corridor is optimistic. It shows you that even if you are in the wrong place, then there is a direction in which you need to go. For Russia, as it's obvious on your graphic, you need to increase the power of the society.
Yep, perfectly, Konstantin.
Хорошо, мне кажется, остается только поблагодарить.
All right, I think that we need to thank our speaker for this great presentation. Thank you very much for being here with us. I think that these lessons are very important for living in Moscow and Russia.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to be here, to join you all.